Well, good morning. We are finishing up 1 Thessalonians today. So those of you who have been around with us and maybe in small groups discussing this, hopefully it's been a beneficial study. This letter to an infant church, trying to kind of tease out foundations of a healthy church family. But today is Advent, and by no coincidence at all, only by divine providence and intervention, we have right in the middle of our passage a command that says, be at peace among yourselves. So we're going to focus on peace here today in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. The text is on your outline, but you're certainly welcome and encouraged to open your Bible to 1 Thessalonians 5 and look at it there as well. The front panel of your outline gives you pretty much the layout of the rest of 1 Thessalonians, the rest of this chunk of text I was given today. We're not going to focus on all of it. We're simply going to focus on the first few verses. So on the back of the handout, you'll notice marks of a church at Shalom. But let's talk about peace here. Let's back up a little bit and kind of get our bearings. When we think of peace, some of us think of world peace, the us and them kind of thing. Others of us think of personal peace, peace between me and God, which is really the foundation of all peace, isn't it? And then there's another option, and that is communal peace, peace between me and you on the job, and in this case in the church or in our families. And today, this is where we're focusing because this is where our passage is at. I'm going to put it on the screen and you'll see how this challenge to be at peace among yourselves is sandwiched right in the midst of these very practical commandments in our passage. In fact, this is one of these passages that you can apply, I guarantee it, before you leave the church today. In fact, where's Jasmine? Where are you at, Jasmine? There she is over here. So Jasmine comes in the door and she says something to me this morning. And I told her, Jasmine, you have already applied the sermon and you haven't heard it yet. And I told her she had to figure out what that was as we go through this. So I'm going to ask her on the way out. Okay? Okay, so here's our passage, and follow along as I read it. This is our text for this morning from God's Word. We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work. Be at peace among yourselves. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak. Be patient with them all. See that no one repays evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Be at peace among yourselves. This is a communal peace, isn't it? The church at Thessalonica. And I talk about this not in terms of a church at peace, but in terms of a church at Shalom. And the reason for that is when I hear the English word peace, I just think of the absence of hostility. But when I hear the word shalom, I think of something, not just the absence of hostility, but the presence of a sense of wholeness and rightness. And if you look at the commandments in this passage, this is not simply about the absence of hostility, is it? It goes way beyond that to encouraging one another, helping one another, and painfully at times, admonishing one another as well. So that's the first thing. Second thing before we jump in here that I want you to notice, because this is going to be crucial. Those of us who just come to church on Sunday get a lot of information. Those of us who are in community with each other in small groups, ministry teams, and other settings experience the kind of transformation that God has for us. Every one of the commandments Paul gives in this passage assume the church as a surrogate family. The church is a family. Look at our text. The word brothers occurs twice in these two short verses. And as we've learned around here over the years, brothers isn't just another moniker for Christian. It is loaded with all the expectations, both obligations, the trust, all that involves a healthy family, in this case, a healthy church family. So as we go through these commandments one at a time today, I'm going to remind you that none of this stuff will work unless you are deeply engaged in community with one another in some form, some context here at Oceanside Christian Fellowship, or if you're a visitor this morning in your own church family. All right, let's jump in and get some blanks filled in on your outline. Those of you who like to have all the blanks filled in will be rewarded today, because I think I'll get through it all, which is not always the case, as you know. All right, first mark of a church at Shalom is a church at Shalom values its leaders. A church at Shalom values its leaders. The first couple of verses, it says, Paul says, we ask you, brothers, to respect Pastor Joe and to esteem him very highly because in love. Now, that would be very self-serving this morning for me to get up here. And these are hard passages for a pastor to preach on, obviously, as you can see. So how about I'm going to give you a list of 10 ways you can esteem Pastor Brandon. No, just kidding. Here's what I'm going to do with this passage. Folks, I'll just tell you, we as your elders feel the love of this congregation. I mean, this is a remarkable church to work in. We feel esteemed. We feel loved. From my perspective, I'll just speak for myself here, I feel no need to exhort you to encourage and esteem your leaders. I feel encouraged and loved. But we're not the only ones doing ministry here, are we? We have people back in Sunday school and youth ministry and hospitality. We have people running soundboards and lights, and we have a worship team and a worship leader. And so when you go and pick up your kid from Sunday school a day, say something. Say something. Esteem your leaders highly in love. When Pearl puts together a set that just really touches your heart and you walk out of here just connected to God, say something. Say something. And our church will be shalom, be at peace as a result. Now, there are a couple things I want to tease out of this first few verses about leadership. The first one is that a church at Shalom, a healthy church, has recognized leadership. Now, that might be self-evident to you because you're in a church that has elders, you know who we are, and you've delegated us the responsibility and authority to lead the congregation, and it makes sense to you and all that. But, you know, this doesn't make sense to everybody. We have a whole generation of folks out here now in the younger generations who have a hermeneutic of suspicion about authority, power, and the exercise of power, and often with good reason because of abuses of authority that they've experienced in church and in other settings. And so here's a fellow who is a pastor over in the UK, and here's how his church operates. Check this out. He says the leadership is organic and open. He says everyone, whether they've been around and in relationship with people like myself for years, or they have been here only twice, everyone has equal access and voice to help shape the next gathering or to offer assistance and participation. Now think about that. That would mean that somebody who is here at OCF for the second time would be welcome to come up to Pearl and tell her what songs they want her to play next week. Pearl, do you know any Janis Joplin or Amy Winehouse? You know, this is a recipe for theological and social chaos. It sounds wonderful, sounds feely-touchy, but it's not, folks. And the Bible's very clear about this structured leadership thing. In fact, the Thessalonian church, as we've learned, Paul was only there 2-3 weeks maybe. Now he's writing a few months later, and this church already has people that they know, who they know are their leaders. It must have been an important thing for Paul to make sure that this structure was in place. So that's an important point there. Why would somebody even want to go here and have a free-for-all like this? Well, again, it's because of what people have experienced in their pilgrimage, often in churches and various social groups, when people are given authority who shouldn't individually wield that authority in the way they have. And I've mentioned to you that often in my office out of Biola University over the years, for one reason or another, has become a bit of a clearinghouse for associate pastors, others in churches who have been grievously hurt by senior pastors and those above them wielding authority in an unhealthy way. And so it's understandable that we have a culture, especially our young people, our millennials and others, that really struggle with the exercise of leadership in organizations like the church, which puts the onus on us to exercise that leadership in a godly, humble servant way. But there are biblical safeguards that are built in to help us do that. One is a church at Shalom has not a single pastor or a senior pastor, but a team of leaders. You will look in vain for a New Testament church with a pastor. Whether it's Paul's churches, the churches James writes to, the churches Peter writes to, it's always elders, always leaders, plural. And here, even in this brand new baby church, apparently Paul felt it was important because notice, We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you. Esteem them highly because of their work. The early Christians did not invest the kind of pastoral authority that an elder has in a single person. They invested it in a group of people, and the checks and balances that result are wonderful, as many of us have experienced who've been in a model like this. Okay, finally, a church at Shalom that values its leaders, and this will be our last observation about leadership from our text, esteems service and character over position and title. I was raised that we need to respect the office, even if we don't respect the officer. So, like, my parents, I think back, how many presidents have I lived through? Started with Eisenhower. Who's he, you guys? Eisenhower, and Kennedy, and Nixon, and Ford, and Lyndon Johnson. I know I'm going to forget some, and Carter, and oh my gosh, the Bushes, and Clinton, and on and on. And I was taught, you're not going to like all these presidents, but you need to respect the office. And I think that is right when it comes to the public, realm. It's true for police officers and on and on. But interestingly enough, you don't see any of that in the New Testament. People are not respected because they are in an office or have educational credentials after their name. They are respected, right? It was right in our text here. They are respected because of their work, because of their labor. That's the bottom line. So, Church at Shalom values its leaders, and these principles are there. It's kind of the point of departure to keep a church healthy, whole. All right, let's continue with one that is, frankly, it's really hard to hear. Church at Shalom helps us grow up. Helps us grow up. Most of us don't want to grow up. I don't want to grow up. People ask me, what are you going to do? I tell people, I still don't know what I'm going to do when I grow up, But this is part of the Christian life. And so our passage challenges not just leaders, but mutually, brothers, sisters, to admonish the idle. Admonish the idle. In fact, it's right in the middle here of the text. It says, we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. And you see that word idle, you might wonder, well, what does that mean? Typically, word has been translated idle because of the way the word is used elsewhere in the Thessalonian correspondence. So notice how it's used in the second letter to the Thessalonians. We're going to study 2 Thessalonians in the spring together. But notice, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. For we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busy bodies. So here's somebody who's able to work, but is unwilling to work, and they're identified with the same word used over in our passage for this translated idle. The interesting thing, if you compare these two passages, in the second passage, there's all kinds of definitions surrounding this word idle that really slot it very narrowly as being lazy and not willing to work. In the first passage, we don't have any of this contextual help, and the fact is, the translation idle is not the meaning of this word. It's simply one meaning of a word that has much broader application, much broader meaning. And to give you some idea, look at some of these translations of our verse from other English translations of the Bible. Check this out. The Holman Christian Standard Bible. Warn those who are not idle, but what? Irresponsible. That would include people who are idle, but a little broader term. This one here, idle and disruptive. And then perhaps the most literal English translation we have, the NASB, translates our passage, admonish the unruly. It's very kind of a broad, general word, isn't it? So here, I think it's fair, whatever we talk about this particular passage being about, it's fair to broaden the application to those who are not simply unwilling to work, but able to do so, but to say basically that Paul is challenging us to admonish in love, of course, anyone whose behavior compromises and disrupts the relational shalom of the community in any way. We are charged to admonish anyone who disrupts and compromises the relational shalom of the church family in any way. Have you ever had anybody say this to you? No? Wow. If you're part of a healthy family, a natural family, certainly you have. My goodness. My wife says this to me all the time. And once in a while I fight right back. And we fed it to our kids over the years, and now they're old enough to say it to us. Yeah, this is just part of a healthy family, isn't it? Being called when we get out of line. And the interesting thing is, this is the general meaning of this term. It was a military term used for Roman soldiers who were in line for battle. They were lined up. And when one of them got out of line, this was the word that was used to describe them. And you think about our lives and our natural families function. A family functions in a healthy way when everybody's kind of in line and everybody's going in the same direction. And then, mom or dad or one of the kids will get out of line, and all of a sudden things don't work as good, do they? We can't deal with what's out there as well. And so this is the picture here. And so what this really means then is that a healthy family, including a healthy church family, this is what Paul's talking about here, is going to at times involve correction, admonishment, constructive criticism from those who love us. It's just how a church at Shalom works. Now, I have another verse from a book in the Bible that we haven't studied yet here at Oceanside Christian Fellowship. It's First Hellermanians, okay? First Hellermanians 1:1, all right? This is not really from the Bible. If you're a guest with us, please, okay? But that's my last name if you're a guest with us, all right? I'm making up my own verses here. But this is really important stuff because a church will not be at Shalom unless we own this. And it's this: how we respond to constructive criticism from those who love us. Again, this assumes relationship. Is a key sign of our emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. Folks, you can take that to the bank. How we respond to constructive criticism from those who love us is a key sign of our emotional, relational, and spiritual maturity. And if you've been married a month, you know that's true, right? Okay? So how do we respond to constructive criticism? Say somebody comes up and calls me out on my behavior at my church. How am I going to respond to that? Well, option number one, I can just leave and go to another church where there aren't any of those mean people and where everybody will treat me nice. Okay? And we see this pattern repeated again and again. The early church didn't have that choice. There wasn't another church down the street from the church at Thessalonica to go to. They were stuck. They had to make family work, kind of like in our natural families, right? I don't get up and move, split when Joanne has something to say to me, okay? But we do in our churches because we got churches down the street, all right? But we do so to our spiritual demise, folks, because we end up just repeating the same cycles of dysfunction again and again and again. So a better option, how about this? We can stop and do a little self-examination and consider the source of that constructive criticism. The guy who planted this church, Duke Windsor, had a way with words, and he said something one time that has stuck with me. I've hung on to this all my life. And Duke and I go back to when I was in my early 20s doing ministry. He said this. He says, if one person calls you a jackass, blow him off. If two people call you a jackass, look in the mirror. In other words, stop and reflect a little bit about your behavior. If several of your closest brothers in Christ call you a jackass, you better get a saddle. Okay? Okay? Reality. I was reading and by the way, a lot of times people who are in spirit, leadership in this, we read this stuff and we're thinking how we can learn to admonish people in our congregation. I was reading this book on pastoral leadership some time back where this guy starts talking about this deal of admonishing the unruly, the author, and I'm thinking he's going to give me some tips for dealing with problem people in my congregation. When in fact, he turned the tables and talked about an incident when he was admonished and rebuked for being out of line. And it was very powerful, so I thought I'd read it to you. Several years ago, Canton Bible Church terminated Bill, one of our paid pastors, this fellow writes. Bill's poor use of time and his lack of productivity had generated not a little frustration among others at church who were carrying more than their weight in their respective areas of ministry. A move to a new facility which called for sacrifice and a servant's attitude on everyone's part sharply accentuated the latent resentment that had been building up among the staff. We knew that something was wrong when Robert, One of our other pastors, one of our most productive and effective ministers, began to explore the secular job market outside the church. So we set up a meeting with Bill, Robert, and the rest of the pastors to address the issue. I was seldom at church during the week and had little firsthand exposure to the dysfunction in the office, though I do recall being quite annoyed when Bill showed up late week after week to our elder meetings. I was pretty close to Robert, however, and I became extremely troubled when I found out that his frustration with Bill had led Robert to start looking for another job. I came to the meeting with guns loaded, determined to be an advocate for Robert and the rest of the church staff. For several hours, this fellow writes, we went back and forth with Bill. There was next to no ownership on his part. Here were 6 of Bill's fellow leaders raising serious concerns about his work as a pastor and church employee. He responded by rationalizing his behavior and telling us that that we had it wrong on every count. A series of follow-up meetings led to Bill's termination, and we soon hired a new pastor to take his place. The atmosphere around the office changed dramatically for the better. I'd said some very pointed things to Bill in the course of that initial meeting. All of my statements were objectively true. In the heat of discussion, however, I did not share my convictions in a loving way. Then this fellow writes, after Bill left the room as we sat around planning our next steps, several of my fellow pastor elders told me in no uncertain terms that I'd been hurtful in my comments. They insisted that I owed Bill an apology. The rebuke was hard to hear. It caught me completely off guard. Our natural tendency in a situation like this is to retreat into a defensive posture. I was tempted to rebuff the critique and to go back over the things I had said in the meeting, one by one, demonstrating that each point I had made was true. After all, it didn't seem like the 2 remaining elders had a problem with how I handled myself. What kept me from defending my behavior, however, were the relationships I had with the men who challenged me about the tone of my comments that day. I knew these men well enough to trust them with my life. They knew me too. They appreciated my strengths, and they were quite aware of my weaknesses. I recognized that these guys would only rebuke me with my best interests and the best interest of the church in view. So we set up a meeting, and I apologized to Bill for the hurtful manner in which I had framed my words. I told Bill that I stood by the content of what I'd said, but I told him that I deeply regretted the way in which I communicated it to him. I asked Bill for his forgiveness, and he graciously responded in turn. Well, that was not Canton Bible Church. That was Oceanside Christian Fellowship. And the author of this was yours truly. And probably one of the hardest things I've gone through in my years of ministry. But it was such a right thing, such a healthy thing, such a good thing for my fellow elders to do at that point in my pilgrimage. Now, again, what this assumes, for those of you who are the admonishers and now making a list of people you're going to go out and admonish, what this assumes, again, is brother, 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 brother. You earn the right to be heard by the trust and the bond you have built with those you are challenging. And it gets back to the same thing. If you only come to church on Sundays, you're going to get plenty of information. It's only when you get deeply in community with one another you're going to experience transformation. And it sometimes hurts deeply. I remember there was a period of a week or so between the point at which I was challenged and the meeting that we had. And during that week was what is called the Fred Hall Show, which is the big, giant annual fishing tackle show down at the Long Beach arena. It's a when I was fishing a lot, it was a highlight of my year, and I had a miserable time there because of this thing hanging over my head. But again, it was the right thing to do, and God used it in my life and the life of our church. All right. Thirdly, this will be easier to hear. A church at Shalom helps us hang on. A church at Shalom helps us hang on. Paul says, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak. 2 different categories. The faint-hearted are people who are temporarily in need of special encouragement. You ever get to the point in your life where you're just slogging through the Christian life, and it's just like wave after wave, set after set of these waves just keep crashing in front of you, and you can barely come up for air, and it gets to the point where you can hardly even pray. God just seems like a million miles away, and you're just about ready to give up. Maybe you're caring for an aging parent. We had my mom living with us for 2 years before she died back in the 90s in our little house. And our girls were sleeping in one room. She was in the other room. Joanna and I were in the living room for the better part of 2 years. And there were points where we were empty. We were just empty. Some of you, it's your job. Some of you, it's health issues that just keep hammering you. And there's just not the physical and emotional, let alone the spiritual energy. Hard even to talk to God. I remember I've shared with you a story when I was up in Mammoth Lakes on vacation one summer. My appendix burst, and I was in the hospital for 9 days, and it got so bad that I couldn't even pray. And a buddy had to encourage the faint-hearted and drive all the way up from the South Bay here to Mammoth Lakes, pray with me for a half hour, and drive home the same day because I couldn't talk to God, but he could talk to God for me. We all come to those places in our lives where we're faint-hearted and we need encouragement. And again, that can only happen when? If we're in community with people who know what's going on in our lives and we know what's going on in their lives. So many of our churches, we sit in little rows on Sunday and the person next to us could have lost a spouse, lost a job, had a cancer diagnosis, whatever, and we wouldn't even know it because we're not in community with one another. You can't be in community with everybody in your church, but my goodness, find some people who you can connect with so that God can love you through them and God can love them through you when you hit these inevitable places that we all land at where we are out of spirit, so to speak. Now, of course, we're never really out of spirit, but boy, there are times where God seems a million miles away, and if that hasn't happened to you yet, it will. It will. Encourage the faint-hearted. Now, the weak are a little bit different category. Notice I define them as permanently in need of special encouragement. Now, in the ancient world, a little bit different than our world. Ancient world, you had classes in society that there was no hope for social mobility. So slaves, freed persons, widows, there were people who were permanently in need of help. And if they were part of a church family, the church family provided that help. These days, we don't have that as much, at least not in the culture we're involved in here in the South Bay, but it's been my observation, folks, there are always going to be people whose social skills, relational skills, or maybe their physical capacities or their mental capacities will never change. They will be permanently in need of help and encouragement, and the church should have a wide place for these kind of folks. When I first became a Christian, one of the things I just noticed that was a radical change from the world I came out of. I graduated from high school, and of course there's all these cliques in high school. I went to Redondo High School, and the surfers and the jocks and it was on and on. And then a little older, and I'm in this musician crowd. And then I became a Christian. I walked into this college class. I was 23 years of age. And you talk about a bunch of people who I would have seen as very weird before I got saved, who are now my brothers and sisters in Christ, and God in His Spirit gave me this new appreciation for people who need encouragement permanently because of disabilities in various areas of our lives. Now, the interesting thing here is we look at the early church, we discover that helping those permanently in need of encouragement goes beyond acceptance, however, to assistance, financial assistance, sometimes permanent financial assistance. Many churches are very, very good with a benevolent fund that helps people who come to a moment of crisis in their life and give them a one-time gift to get them over the hump. The early church, we don't like to hear this phrase, it makes the hair on my neck bristle when I hear it, describing, semi-socialist countries elsewhere in the world. But do you know that the early church had a guaranteed annual income for certain people in their congregation who were permanently in need of help? All you got to do is read 1 Timothy 5, how the church handled widows, 1 Timothy 5 and 6, and you will see that there were widows on this list who were permanently helped by the church, not just over the hump, but permanently helped. Now, these widows were very carefully vetted, and Paul even gives qualifications. He tells the church how to sort between those who need and warrant the church help and those who should not get it. And that's a really, really important thing. We, at our own church, have had situations where we have helped people not just one time, but month after month, and even year after year, who were willing but unable to provide for their families. And those people have been very carefully vetted, so your money is spent wisely. In fact, in the earlier service, Gary Gasparian was here, and Gary Gasparian heads up a deacons fund of 4 people: Gary, Mike Mason, Teresa Schluter, who's also on our administrative staff here, and Eric Hardy. And so when people ask for help, or we find out people need help, whether it's a one-time gift or something a little bit more involved, they get together with them and go through their financials and all kinds of details. So this stuff is done wisely and carefully. And this gives me an opportunity to make a comment to perhaps help some of us be a little bit more wise with our money. You guys are an incredibly compassionate group of people. And we see that. Sometimes, however, that is taken advantage of. We have had people in our congregation who actually, there are people who are able but unwilling to work. And there are people like these widows we're talking about who are willing but unable. We've had people in our congregation who we as elders know are able but unwilling, who know how to work the system and come around and ask you guys for resources because they know you love Jesus and you're compassionate. And what I'm saying is you're not doing them any favors by giving them resources. Send them to Gary, send them to the deacons, send them to the elders, and allow us to vet them and help them so that our money is given wisely. So this is just a little bit of background about what goes on behind the scenes here. But again, the early church was no qualms about putting somebody in genuine need on a long-term assistance program, because that's what family does. That's what a natural family does. Okay? A church that at Shalom cuts us a whole lot of slack. A church at Shalom cuts us a whole lot of slack. Paul says, be patient with them all. And if you've ever been around a church and got as deeply involved relationally as we're talking about getting involved today, you know that you need to be patient. And in fact, this is a beautiful word. Patient in the New Testament is a kind of a kitbash word that means long on anger. And it doesn't mean to be angry a long time, just the opposite. It means a long time before you pop, okay? And where does that come from? It's our Lord. It's at the heart of the character of the Jesus, of the God we worship. Check it out. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. And if you think about what God put up with in the Old Testament with Israel, his patience, you think about what Jesus put up during his earthly ministry, and you just get this picture of a God who understands our brokenness, understands that we stumble. Some of us need to be forgiven 70 times 7. It's just who we are, and a church at Shalom makes room for that. Finally, a church at Shalom does a whole lot of good. This is kind of Paul's summary where he says, do good to one another and to everybody. Don't you love Paul? He just said, do good to one another, to everybody. So there, okay, that's what I mean. You know? And so this is a beautiful picture. But folks, again, this is a sobering picture. It is not an easy picture, and it is not a superficial picture, is it? It means hard work. It means sacrifice. It means compassion. It means really getting to know one another. And that's what Church as a Family is all about. Let's pray.